Welcome to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We provide fiction reviews for the lit, curious reader, because why not try a little of everything? Our scholarish approach and cozy book club atmosphere makes literature accessible to everyone. Whether you're a casual reader or a devoted bookworm, join us on our literary journey to explore all genres. Hello, and welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs. I'm Joey, and today Jennifer and I will be having an affair with Carmen Maria Machado and her short story, The Husband Stitch, which was published in Granta Magazine in 2014 and is also included in her short story collection, Her Bodies and Other Parties, which was published in 2017. So before I give a summary, let me just give you a brief bio of who Carmen Maria Machado is if you have never heard of her. So she is the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House, the graphic novel The Low, Low Woods, and the award-winning short story collection Her Body and Other Parties. She has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the Lambada Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, the Lambada Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction, the Brooklyn Public Library Literature Prize, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize. That was a mouthful. In 2018, the New York Times listed Her Body and Other Parties as a member of the New Vanguard, one of the 15 remarkable books by women that are shaping the way we read and write fiction in the 21st century. Her essays, fiction, poetry, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Granada, as we know, Vogue, The American Life, Harper's Bazaar, Tin House, McSweeney's, Quarterly Concern, The Believer, Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, Best American Non-Required Reading, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from Iowa Writers Workshop and has been awarded fellowships and residencies from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, Yaddo, I don't know what that is, Hedgebrook, and the Malay Colony for the Arts. She is the former Abrams Artist in Residence at the University of Pennsylvania. She has quite the list of accolades there.
But Joey, you forgot to mention she's under 40 years old. She's also a
is she?
very younger person. So that was
Yeah,
important
she
to
is
my
young.
understanding of this story.
Yeah, she might be like an elder millennial. I don't know. If she's
I
under
believe
40,
she is 38 years old when I
then
checked.
yeah, she's not that much older than me. And don't tell anyone. Just kidding. Okay, so before we give our impressions, I will give us the summary of the story. So, a 17-year-old girl meets a boy at a neighbor's party and feels an instant connection, certain they'll marry. When they kiss, he notices the green ribbon around her neck and asks about it. She brushes it off, but as the relationship deepens, his curiosity grows. She gives him everything except permission to touch the ribbon. They marry young, and during the European honeymoon, she becomes pregnant. After giving birth to a son who has no ribbon, she overhears her husband, under anesthesia, ask the doctor for an extra stitch during her episiotomy. The moment haunts her, a quiet betrayal she never addresses. Over the years, she reflects on stories of girls, women, and mothers facing ghosts, illness, and violence, often instructing readers on how to read her story aloud. She indulges her husband's desire, but never lets him touch the ribbon. One night, he pins her down and touches it, but she freezes and pulls back. Another time, he demands she stop keeping secrets, but she refuses. When their son starts school, she takes an art class and meets a woman with a red ribbon around her ankle. They share coffee, and the narrator feels a rare connection. But shame drives her away. Years later, after their son moves out, the couple makes love in their empty house, and she finally lets him untie the ribbon. As it unravels, her head falls from her neck. The ribbon was all that held it in place. The story ends with her silent truth. Some secrets are meant to stay bound. Okay, so I've said enough. So, Jennifer, please give us your initial impressions to the story.
So, Joey, I had not consciously been aware of this writer before reading the story, and you very cleverly, which I will say, have picked the story which reflects some of the themes that we have talked about previously. So when I encountered the story, all I saw was the title of the story that said The Husband Stitch. I did not consciously see the writer's name. So I immediately was turned off. I'm like, I do not want to read the story about the husband Stitch because just last month, Brooke Shields wrote in her memoir, Brooke Shields is Not Allowed to Get Old, that's the name of her memoir, about receiving this unwanted gynecological event in her life without her consent. And the doctor like telling her about it. It's like, hey, I gave you like a 2-for-1 special. You came in here for one thing, but I gave you this extra thing. Isn't that awesome? And she was like, no, not awesome at all. Actually, that feels like a violation of everything about me. So just reading the title of the story, I'm like, no, thank you, sir. I am not interested in reading this story at all. Luckily for me, I carried forward, and
Mhm.
she had me from the very first moment when she's like, hi, if you're reading this aloud, here are some ways that I would like you to interpret these characters. Here are some things that I would like to do. And so, Joey, I know sometimes we talk about a person's gender, their age range, where they grew up, what their nationality is, how that might inform their writing. And I think in this case, for me, I did not know until way, 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 way after I read the story that she is a lesbian woman who is writing from a very unique perspective. So I will just say this story is not what I expected. It was beautiful. It is not for the faint of heart. It is very explicit. It is erotic. It is horrific. It is a morality tale. It is a sexual liberation. It's all the things, Joey. So it
Mhm.
really was hard for me to pin this down. Say, like, what is this story actually about? I'm like, all the things it means to be a woman. And the thing that was interesting for me before I ask you about your opinions of this, because I know that you've experienced this story probably from a very different lens, that I was also curious because there are no discernible time points in this story which would indicate to me the author's age. Because some of the ideas that she's putting forth felt old fashioned to me, like kind of a generation, even the generation before me. Like my parents would have had some of these same attitudes of the people in the story that she was representing. So it was very refreshing and interesting for me to contemplate that she is a generation younger than me, but she's espousing in some ways attitudes that may be prevalent in the generation above me. So, Joey, I am
Mhm.
dying to hear what you have to say about this. And thank you. Let me just say one more thing. Thank you, thank you, thank you for picking the story and not spoiling it for me because you're like, oh, do you know the girl with the green ribbon? I'm like, nope. You're like, okay, I'm not going to say anything
Yeah,
else
I'm not
about
gonna
it. And then
tell
I
you
was
the
like,
ending.
are you kidding me? Like, did that just happen? It's, are you, no, this
Yeah.
is not the story she wrote. This is not where the story was going. It's like, surprise. I told you in my first opening paragraphs, this is about sex. It's about power. It's about horror. It's about storytelling. I'm like, man, she nailed it.
Yeah, that is something that I was thinking about before I give my initial impressions, that we're not really grounded in any time. There's not a period. We can't discern anything. We don't know. There's no like, we can't like Google something to be like, oh, when was this popular? Like, I think she did a good job of making it timeless. This could happen at literally any point in history and it would be believable because the dynamic is still relevant. So I'll just start with my impressions, which is that I've read this story before and I own the collection that it's in, the Her Bodies and Other Parties. Um and I also have read The Girl with the Green Ribbon, which is a horror story for children by Alvin Schwartz, which was in his collection called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and is was like extremely popular back in the day when I was a kid. I mean, this stuff scared the shit out of all of us. So I knew this story immediately. As soon as I saw there was a green ribbon on her neck, I was like, that's keeping her head in place. That's the only I know this story. So I was spoiled for the ending. I already knew it was going to happen, but I didn't know how we were going to get. Obviously, I knew what the husband stitch was, and I have watched some pretty horrendous videos about FGM or female genital mutilation. That this is included in that when they would have their clitoris removed. So, but I wanted to get like an exact definition, like the from a medical-esque website. So this is from Healthline. So they say the husband stitch or daddy stitch, which I did not know that was what it was also referred to, refers to an extra stitch added during the repair of an episiotomy after childbirth. This unethical practice, supposedly intended to tighten the vagina for a male partner's sexual pleasure, has a long troubling history and is now considered medical malpractice. So I didn't look it up because I didn't have time, but it's possible that this was a thing that was performed in the United States and other countries in the global north,
I believe that is true
which
because
is
Brooke
gross.
Shield has
Yes.
recorded that in her memoir and said the reason that she did not prosecute that particular doctor is because she didn't want the shame of having to go to trial. So again, there's a lot of those nuanced things of even though a crime was permitted, she wanted to preserve her dignity and not reveal it at the time it happened. And now
Mhm.
she's throwing caution to the wind and be like, you know what? I'm actually going to say this out loud. So I think the fact that this story, written prior to her memoir, was a really nice reflection of we're not dealing with the shame thing anymore. You know how we're dealing with
Yeah.
shame? We're saying it. And I really appreciated that, Joey. And thank you for
Yeah.
giving us the medical definition of what
Well,
that
I'm sure there's a
technically
better
is for.
medical one, but it's a good summary just to so we understand this is what it was and what the purpose of it was
And Joey, can I
for
stop you
male
for
pleasure.
Yeah, can I stop you for 1 second?
Mhm.
Because when there's this whole thing about the green ribbon, right? And she's like, "Don't touch it. I want to make sure it stays nice and tight. Like I got to keep it tidy. Like don't put your fingers in
Mhm.
it." I thought, "Oh my gosh, is she gonna at least that I didn't know her head was gonna fall off, Joey. I did not know. Okay, so that was a surprise to me. I did not know. Not a millennial kid, so I didn't read ghost stories
Mhm.
as a child. And I was like, oh my goodness, is the husband stitch that she takes her green ribbon off and she like puts a stitch through the middle of it. So even if he tries to untie it, he can't. And I was like, oh,
Good guess, but no.
but no.
It's a lot weirder than that.
But no, so much worse.
I didn't know that about Brooke Shields. I had not read her memoir, but that's unfortunate, obviously. Something that is not included in this definition, and then I'll go right back to I'm just going to finish up what I was saying with my initial impressions was that according to these women that I have seen videos from and their interviews, that it makes it difficult for them to even like urinate. It's not a it's nothing is beneficial to the woman in this. It makes their lives extremely difficult and painful for no reason. Anyway, just to make that clear. I was only not only struck by that this is something that was practiced in this story, that the author sort of passes it by. Like it happens, she's sort of like obviously the protagonist who is unnamed and her husband's also unnamed. I don't think anyone has a name in this story. It's obviously discussed and she is under anesthesia so she can't really do anything, but it never really comes up. She doesn't explain the pain that will cause her to have sex with this now or to urinate or when she's menstruating, anything like that. There's no mention of it. And I don't think it's because Carmen Maria Machado was trying to be negligent of that. I think sort of, and this might relate to Brooke Shields. Obviously, I didn't read it, like I said, so I don't know, but it's sort of like the shame of bringing it up, of acknowledging that this thing happened and that it's causing some type of tribulations. So I can see how that makes sense. And I was kind of curious, like, why is this not being discussed? Like, this is the name of the story. It's obviously super important, but I think that makes a lot more sense if we use the Brooke Shields for context, is that it's a lot of shame that she might be feeling, which is unfortunate. And I'll leave my initial impressions there because I've been talking long enough.
Thank you for
Let
that,
me go
Joey.
take a
So I actually, as you've heard multiple times in the last few weeks, I've been watching Call the Midwife, which is set in the UK in the 50s and 60s. And there was even an incident in that fictionalized TV show about a male doctor who got impatient with the midwifing process. And he was like, no, we need to cut this particular mother open because I don't want to wait around for her natural dilation process to continue. And the midwife who was there said, I would never have done that. You should have waited. And so for me, just as you were saying, why doesn't this get talked about? Who is performing these procedures? I personally would be very surprised, and this is just my feeling, I don't have any factual evidence, if other women, gynecologists, OBGYNs, are performing this or have performed this on other women as a result of their childbirthing, right? Lots of women have to have this episiotomy. That's a total standard thing, but you just kind of put things back where they started. You don't make some improvements to it in their mind. And I just thought that was such an interesting question of why is this being done? And I hear what you said. It's like, yes, it's not a cost-free experience. And in the actual, and cost-free, I mean like a biological and physical
Mhm.
cost. And I appreciate it in the story how clearly Carmen calls out I was under anesthesia. I said, please don't cut me. She didn't want to have a cesarean. That's what she thought was going to happen. And she's like, oh, they didn't do a cesarean. They did something else. You were cut out of me in a different way. And she, even under anesthesia, said, no, no, please don't. And they're like, ah, nobody's looking at you. Nobody's talking to you. And she's like, oh, I guess pain and anesthesia makes you remember things differently. So I was so angry that A, this happened to her, and B, she gaslighted herself about consent or not consent because she's like, oh, I might have misremembered how that happened. I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't think you did.
It's complicated and it's tragic that this is in the story, but I think it's important for these types of discussions to happen, and because even if it's not something that's being practiced on the surface, I mean, who knows? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I couldn't tell you.
And Joey,
Uh,
the name of this collection, right? She did write this story previously, and then it was included in her collection called Her Body and Other Parties. That is a very provocative thought, as well as like party for who? Do you mean like parties to a settlement or parties like woohoo, it's a party? Or like what is that title? So I do applaud the author for being very intentionally vague in some of her choices to allow each person to say, wait, what did you mean by that? Like,
mhm,
is my body a party? And the reason I say this, she did an extraordinarily good job from my vantage point as a female of expressing female desire, of talking really about bodily sensation and psychological characteristics, and also just the restrictions and pain of child rearing and becoming pregnant and carrying this baby to term and delivering him. So I just think this particular author does not shy away from difficult topics. And the whole reason I said that
mhm.
to you is I looked her up really quick before our meeting tonight, and the Stanford Review, I believe that was the publication, said something to the effect of, this is a difficult story to discuss, and this is why the story should be discussed. So the fact
Yeah.
that, we may have lost some listeners already thinking it's like, oh my goodness, is this whole episode going to be about this very hard topic? It is, but it is in the context of consent, of women's rights, about societal expectations, about whose pleasure gets prioritized when there has to be a choice. So yeah, Joey, just wanted to throw that in there, that we know that this is a difficult topic, and that's almost the point of the story.
That's the point of the story is bodily autonomy. Tripping over my word because that's a super important part. I mean, she receives this procedure without her consent, and it in the name she does not. It's not women's consent does not matter. Obviously, it's not called the wife stitch because it's the wife that decides to sew her vagina up. It's her husband and this male doctor. Anyway, I could get a whole thing about that. But before we go back to that, I do want to talk. You were in your opening impressions, you were talking about how the structure of the story, and that we're given directions on how we should be reading this story because we should be reading this aloud. And I'm just going to read the very opening part of the story. So, if you read the story out loud, please use the following voices: me, as a child, high pitched, forgettable; as a woman, the same; the boy who will grow into a man and be my spouse, robust with his own good fortune. I could have told you that. My father, like your father, or the man you wish was your father. My son, as a small child, gentle, rounded with the faintest of lisps. As a man, like my husband. All other women, interchangeable with my own. So she's giving us so much information about characters we have literally not even met yet. We understand the way that this narrator, because it's not, I guess it's not really supposed to, I could be Carmen Maria Machado, who is the narrator, but I don't think so. I think this is like a fictitious woman. So the narrator is giving us so much information about how she sees herself, how she thinks society sees her, how she sees her husband as a teenager and then as a man, how she sees her father, the sort of like the idealized version of her father. Her mother's not even mentioned, except for all other women interchangeable with my own. Me, like, so they're she's sort of seeing them as second class citizens here. It's sort of like this weird juxtaposition or dichotomy, really, from that and the actual beginning of the story, because we meet her as a teenager. She's 17 and she's sneaking white wine spritzers maybe when behind her dad's back at a neighbor's party, and she sets her eyes on this man, other teenager who will eventually become her husband and do the husband stuff thing. We meet her as a very confident and strong and powerful young woman who is like, I want to have sex with that one and I'm going to do it. I mean, it's consensual. It's a consensual transactional relationship here, but in the beginning, um, but it's such a what I really loved about this story is how the author shows us how abuse is very insidious in this story, because we see two different people when we meet this woman and when we leave her with her head rolling on the carpet. These are very different women. And so we get so much time in such a short amount of story to really trace, like, where does all of this come from. And I think there are other clues in here that I'm sure we'll get into, of like, why does she have this relationship with sex and all of that other stuff. But I just wanted to talk about how we get those sort of stage directions, because she's encouraging us to read this out loud and act it out. And I think the purpose of that is to say, if you're forced to read this out loud, you have to acknowledge that this is a reality of life, and so you can't walk away like Omelas. Okay, you have to stay and fight. And Kay Jemison. That always goes back to those two stories.
Well, I love that you said that, Joey, because I was like, one of the things that I appreciated throughout the story, and she does this like 5 or 6 times, like multiple times. She's like, here's a little aside that you should be reading out loud, that she is, in my mind, forcing empathy on the reader. I'm like, say this out loud. You read this out loud and see how that sits in your mouth. Do you think this is something you'd want to have happen to you? And when she talked about the episiotomy stitch, she said, ask a
Oh yeah,
member of
yeah.
the audience to slice between your finger and your forefinger and your thumb. Have them slice it, it will bleed. And then you have to say thank you to the person who just did that to you. And I was like, wow, if you did not have a very visceral reaction to like, wait a minute, is that like the platonic or the non-sexualized version of what just happened to this woman? Holy cow, you could not have made that more clear and non-gender specific, correct? Like, I am a biological woman. I identify as that. You are not. So, like, I think our experiences on this planet are very different. But I am assuming, Joey, that when they said, hey, just ask a stranger to come up and just slice you in a very tender spot, and then you have to say thanks. How did
Yeah.
that strike you, Joey? Like, what
Not
was
good.
your view on that?
I mean, yeah, that's a visceral way. I mean, again, it's a genius way to immediately get the reader to empathize in the situation, especially when there could be so much distance. There's so much distance for me as um, a man who identifies as a man, or a male who identifies as man. Um, I'm gay, so I'm never gonna have this experience of watching an episiotomy or being in the same room. It's like, I know women obviously who can give birth, but yeah, it's something that is not something that I would have thought about. What does that feel like? Like, I can understand it logically, like, oh wow, that's probably really painful. But until she says, like, go ahead, do it to yourself, see what it feels like. It's like, no, it's not like this sort of sanitized medical procedure. It fucking hurts.
It so hurts. And Joey, I appreciate, and I have to go back to these like little side notes that she wrote us, because they are so clear when she has this moment with her young son, who is now mimicking these questions he heard from his dad of like, why can't I touch the ribbon at your throat? Like,
Mhm.
why can't I? And she distracts him by taking like a can of pennies and like shake it in his face.
Like a dog.
Yeah, and it's just like, whoa. And the kid is like scared. And I'd really love for us to go to that quote if I can find it. Give me just 1 second, because it was
Mhm.
such an effective way. And again, I just have to keep praising her for the way in which she forces you, if you're reading this out loud, to acknowledge these things that feel a little bit abusive or transgressive. And this is a bit of a longer story than we're used to reading, but I think everything that she put in it, including these multiple versions of folk tales of all these horror
Mhm.
stories that can happen to women. I'm like, uh-huh, because I just went through the one. She's like, oh, my favorite stories are the one about the pioneer woman. Oh, wait, I have another one about the kids necking and the woman gets attacked. And it's just like every story she has reminds us that it's not safe to be a woman. It is just not safe to be a woman. So I'm going to read you the actual bit about the stage notes about the slice. It says, if you are reading the story out loud, give a paring knife to the listener and ask them to cut the tender flap of skin between your index finger and thumb.
Ooh.
Afterwards, thank them. I'm like, no, no.
Yeah, oh,
And
gives me the chills.
there's just like, ouch. Like you just literally just hand it to someone else and just ask them to do that or allow that to them. And I thought that is really creepy. And the thing that I wanted to bring back about the trust violations, because when you said, oh, this is a story of abuse. And I was like, well, kind of, but kind of not, because for many of the things that she does, she is the initiator. She is the person who walked up in the party and kind of propositioned her future boyfriend slash husband. She is the
Mhm.
one who kissed him. And she writes right in her notes, I know this is not how it's supposed to go. Women are not supposed to do this, but I am not interested in following the rules. And I really loved the ownership of that. But then, very quickly, even though she sent two consent rules, she did not want him to impregnate her by finishing their sexual act into completion in that moment because she wanted to get married first. And
It's
I
a very
will not
nice way of saying
add
that.
any more things to that. You may use your imagination or read the story because there are some words that you are going to need to know that I am not going to tell you. And that he was not allowed to touch her ribbon. So we often talk about what are consent, what things are consensual, what are boundaries. So she set super super clear boundaries,
Mhm.
and for the most part, they were honored until they weren't. And so it was just one of those moments of she did receive, I believe, some abusive behaviors from her husband of not respecting the fact that she could have any autonomy over herself. She was
Mhm.
subjected to this medical procedure without her consent. Her husband, she goes to art class. She kind of has this flirtation with this woman. She tells her husband, hey, like something very interesting just happened to me. Let me tell you about it. And her husband turned it into something about himself. He made it his sexual fantasy. And she said, I felt like I violated that woman's privacy by sharing my intimate thoughts with my husband because he is a gross misappropriator of pleasure, right? He just
Yeah,
took
he
that for
fetishized it.
himself. And it was like, hey, that's my story. Find your own story. And she said, imagine, and again, one of those little asides, imagine, reader, that you just whispered in your ear, someone's ear, your most secret secret, and he opened the window and screamed it to the entire frickin' neighborhood. And I was like, yes, that
Yeah, I
is
love that.
very clear indication of her power to say, if you don't know what this feels like, let me just put it in terms you can understand. And I was so angry, Joey, and I promise I'm going to just get off this bandwagon and circle back. But I'm like, you started the conversation in this thread of, was this an abuse story? Like, what kinds of abuse? Right before we hear about that abuse where she felt violated that her husband like shared a secret that was not his to share, he said, tell me your most vulnerable thing. What is the worst thing that ever
Mhm.
happened to you? And she's like, oh, when I was, in elementary school, somebody took me into a closed room and made me do something that I felt really dirty and ashamed of. And I went home and I scratched my hands, the palms of my hands, with a Brillo pad until they were bloody. Said that to her husband. We did not get, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. Wow, that's horrific. Is there anything I can do to comfort you? It was just like a non-issue. And then he's like, oh, well, tell me a story about this like sexy woman you met at art class and let's just turn that into something else. And I was like, huh, that complete lack of curiosity, empathy, caring from her husband was just really glaring. And I'll just leave it at that, Joey. I'm not sure how that episode hit you.
I did wanna talk about that was her worst secret was that she was molested by a teacher when she was growing up, and that she did self harm in return as a sort of some punishment for herself, even though obviously she was the victim, and that was never going to be her fault. So, but I think the point of the author putting it in there, because it doesn't come up except for this one time. As you said, it was like her husband was like, "Oh, okay, I can't really fetishize that because that's kind of messed up, but like let's move on." So why is it in here? And so I think the for me the answer was, what is the relationship that this woman has with sex? Because she is very sexually liberated in the very beginning, where she's and rightfully so. She's 17 years old. She's got raging hormones. Who isn't doing that kind of stuff when you're 17? It makes a lot of sense. She's not doing anything abnormal. She's being normal, a normal 17-year-old girl with another 17-year-old or 18-year-old boy. But I think what happened was with that type of abuse. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist. I do not take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is just like from my experience hearing and listening to people with this type of trauma, that it seems possible that it skewed her relationship with sex for the foreseeable future, because first of all, she didn't this is her secret. This was probably the first time she's ever maybe said it out loud, and it wasn't really acknowledged. It wasn't like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that." Like, how do we help you heal from this experience? It was it was dismissed, and so that probably was not helpful at all, but I think it really set her up on a trajectory to see herself more as an object and less as a human being that gets to enjoy pleasure. And I think she does. She does have a balance. And I think that's what's so great about this story is that Machado does a really great job of showing us the nuance of life, that trauma it's not all black and white. If you were this protagonist was molested as a child, it does not always come up through every single situation for her entire life. I'm sure it comes up in some parts, but it's not constant. It's not like I said, it's not black and white. So I think she understands that she can enjoy sex, but I think that she's also set up to like understand or feel like she's subservient to her husband, whether that is because it's a cultural thing, as in like if this isn't from an older period, then that could be just an expectation. But
Yeah,
go ahead. It looks like you want to say
Joey,
something.
yeah, thank you for taking me there because what just came into my head when you said that is her conversation with the woman at art class about their daughter. She has the art school lady has a daughter, and I'm just going to read this passage because I'm like, oh, some lights just went on when we're talking about what happened in that closet with that teacher. 11 is a terrifying age, she says. I remember nothing before I was 11, but then there it was, all color and horror. What a number, she says. What a show. Then her face slips somewhere else for a moment, as if she has dipped beneath the surface of a lake. We do not discuss the specific fears of raising a girl child. Truthfully, I am afraid to ask. I also do not ask her if she's married, and she does not volunteer the information, though she does not wear a ring. We talk about my son, about the art class. I desperately want to know what state of need has sent her to disrobe before us, but perhaps I do not ask because the answer would be, like adolescence, too frightening to forget.
Mm.
And so when she asks her husband says, "Tell me your biggest or your worst secret." She's like, "I was abused as a child by a teacher." My mind immediately went, the second time we talked about this, was, what about the fact that your head is disconnected from your body? Like, when did that happen and how did that happen? But I also think that the average maturation of girls in the United States when they first get their periods, I think is right around 11. So is she talking about this is when the abuse happened? This is when she got her period. This is just when things kind of go haywire because now you're no longer a little kid. You're like 11. Like that's a big number, right? When you're a little kid, when you turn 11, like that's like a big number. And I just thought that was really very interesting that she doesn't want to know anything more about what might be terrifying about raising a daughter. Because as she said to us in the first paragraph, the first aside, all women are the same. They all have the same experience. You can just pop, you can put Jennifer's name in there, you can put Rachel's name in there, you can put Rebecca, you can put, it does not matter because these things are so universal and we are so inconsequential. It does not matter if I have a name or if it's my mother, my sister, or me. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter. And I was like, yikes. That's just a
Yeah,
lot
it's
to think about. Yikes.
yeah, not a hopeful message.
Not good. But Joey, sorry, I'll go back to the other thing where she does own her sexuality. She writes some very pornographic and erotic pieces in this. I'm like, whoa, Joey, like what? Where did this story come from exactly? Is this letters to Penthouse or is this like an actual literary magazine? Because there are some very graphic descriptions that I think were handled very honestly and very
Mhm.
beautifully and very empowering. So even after she, has these experiences with her husband, he does instruct the doctors like, hey, if I pay you a little extra, can you just tighten things up in there for me? And they even almost say the word virgin, but they said,
Yeah.
oh, it makes you like a and they just crossed the word out. And I thought, well, now isn't that interesting? Like you can't even say the word. And since you took her virginity in the first place, like you already punched that ticket, dude. Like you don't get a second chance on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was
It's
just
not a
very
second
yeah,
go.
I was very, very annoyed by that. But even after all of that happens, and the son like goes away to college, she is like, "Oh, my husband and I, we are still being intimate," and she was very happy about their intimacy because she said, "I think back to 17-year-old me at that party. I could have picked any kind of boy. I could have picked my husband. I could have picked a cruel man. I could have picked a different kind of person." And as she's having sexual relations with her husband, she's thinking this and she's like, oh, yeah, I made the right decision. Like, this is the best husband for me. And I was like, what a complicated message. Like, what a
Yeah.
complicated message.
Yeah, I mean, because it's not straightforward, like outright abuse, but abuse doesn't have to be overt. It can be it's very subtle and insidious. So I think that again, this is very nuanced because he's not necessarily abusive to like I don't know how I'm going to say this. Like it's like the abuse comes from him being unwilling to respect her boundaries with her ribbon. He respects the no getting pregnant before before she's ready part, which is very just yes, that's exactly what you should do. So you don't get a pat on the back for being a good human being, sir.
But
But the
Joey, I want to stop you right there for a moment because even the description of when she loses her virginity to him, it's not a picnic, right? She talks
yeah.
about it being painful and dry and having the aftermath of that and going home and like washing herself and seeing the blood in the bathtub. So, like, even though she was a willing participant in that, that was still traumatic and violent and not rainbows and puppies. And so that was just also interesting. But she's like, "Oh, I can see how this might be fun later." And so then she kind of
Yeah.
like
I
forgets
see the
about it. But I was
potential
like,
of this.
"Isn't that interesting?" Because I understand that you and I have had very different experiences in life because our bodies are different. And so you
Mhm.
do not have the same um markers that I do of experience. So when she said she was at, looking down from the stirrups at the doctor while he is performing the stitch for the episiotomy. She's like, I could see his eyebrows knitting like he was sending me Morse code. Now,
Mhm.
I think most women in America who have ever had a pelvic exam knows exactly what that feeling is in a way that a man may not. That is all. I just thought it was just such an interesting positional thing to be like, huh, thank you for saying that. You're just looking at a guy doing his job down there, and you're like, is he trying to send me some coded message with his eyebrows? Like, what is going on in there? I have no
I thought
control over that.
I thought that that meant he was giving a signal to the husband to be like, "I'm gonna sew this one up. It's gonna go back to being virgin tight."
Well, yeah,
Uh,
Joey, well, he did say those words. Like, I don't even have to give you facial signaling that I'm like doing, like giving you side eye, like, I got your back. They said it out loud to each
yeah.
other in front of her when she was incapacitated. I was like, assholes, just so, just so abusive. And I really appreciate that you said the abuse does not have to be she wasn't being beaten at home. She wasn't being
Mm,
starved. She wasn't just, there are a lot of other manifestations of abuse, but the lack of boundaries, the lack of consideration for her and her autonomy to make decisions about herself. It's like, what could be more abusive than taking away my ability to say, there is one secret about me, there is one physicality thing that is just mine. I gave you literally every other inch of my body, including my
yeah.
womb, to create our child. Can you just leave me one teeny tiny little thing that's mine? It's like, nope, I'm the husband and I get everything. And she's like, no, really,
Yeah.
you don't want to know. Like, just trust me on this. And then we get to the other story and we're like,
Yeah, I was
like what just happened here?
yeah. Yeah. I was trying to think of like, well, what is this ribbon like a metaphor for? Because, well, first of all, you brought up a bit ago here that like why do women have this ribbon and when does it come about? So when she gives birth to her son, the first thing she says, no ribbon, then a boy. So I'm assuming that girls are born with a ribbon on some part of their body because obviously we know the woman who was posing at the art class has it on her ankle. And then there's a mom at the PTA thing, or maybe it's not all women, maybe it's a select group of women that has it around one of her fingers. Because there's not really any more commentary. We don't really know. We don't know her mother. We don't think has a ribbon because it's not mentioned. But maybe for whatever it could be one or the other that every woman has a ribbon or a select few women have a ribbon. But because she's looking for that first, that's what I was thinking is like everybody has it, but she's only pointing it out to certain people. Do you want to add something before I keep
Yeah,
going?
no, Joey, it's interesting that you say that because I think the statistics in the United States, especially of women who have either been abused as children or have experienced date rape or other sexual violence, is like a big number, like a lot. I want to say 50%, but that might be an overinflation. I haven't checked the statistics lately, but there is like a really, I think maybe a really good chance in if you talk to three women, one of those three are going to say, yes, I have experienced sexual violence in my lifetime.
Mm,
And maybe that's kind of what this ribbon is like. Every woman has her own version of sexual violence. One had it on her finger, one had it on her ankle. She had hers on her throat. Maybe that was sort of an ambiguous message from the author to say, not everybody has this, but the people who do are are marked. And like if you unraveled the yellow ribbon on the lady who was doing the sewing at the pirate, the pirate party that they were putting things together for kids, would her finger have fallen off? Like, does
yeah.
everyone's part fall off? So I'm like, well, I'd like a ribbon to be placed on your husband's penis because maybe he should like understand the trauma that he has perpetuated with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was just a very interesting thing that you asked, like, does everyone have one? Because she was so mad at her husband when he said, "Oh, you're pregnant? Is it going to have a ribbon too?" And she's like, "Really? That's the first question you're going to ask me? That is the question you're asking me." So for me, it was like, she's like, we won't know until the baby comes. So to your point, Joey, is that evidence to say only girls get this?
Yeah, I see. I could see it either way, but I think because she specifically says no ribbon, that was the thing that she was checking for first, not for if they have all their fingers and their toes, which I think is like a stereotypical thing that parents look for. Is like, oh, does my kid have all their fingers and toes? Not that that shouldn't stop you from loving your child, but whatever. I'm not a parent other than to a dog, and he has four paws, so I guess we're good
And
to
a
go.
tail,
Yeah,
right?
and
So
a
he's
tail.
got all of his things, but you
But
would have
some dogs don't have
checked.
tails, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, so because she checks for the ribbon first, I'm assuming that all female children that are born have a ribbon, and maybe no, I can't even say maybe they get it later because how that how that works out, I don't know. But obviously, you cannot have a ribbon holding your head onto your body and survive. Um, But I was trying to think of like, well, what does this symbolize? What is this ribbon? It can be what you were saying. If it's not all women and it's a select women, maybe it's a mark of some type of trauma or something else like that, where this is sort of the thing that binds them together. No pun intended. But if it's all women, if it's all female, anybody with female genitalia, let's just say that, um, then what else could it possibly mean? Because it's something that men desperately want to claim for their own. So I was thinking, like, is it fertility? Is it the ability to give birth? Is it menstruation, which goes hand in hand? It's something that's innately female that men cannot get. And I'm speaking in binaries, so let's just for this conversation, that's how we're going to speak. So men cannot gain access to this one thing. They can control everything else about women, but they cannot control their menstruation or their, well, I was about to say their reproduction. There's a lot to say about that. But anyway, in reality, if physically men cannot control women's reproduction. They cannot force them to give birth sooner. They cannot make their gestation period go quicker or slower. They cannot stop them from menstruating physically. They can't be like, just stop doing it, cut it out. you know? So is this what this is symbolizing? This thing that all women may have? I don't know.
So, Joey, what was so interesting for me, because I am curious about that, this is opening up, and I was like, is this like the idea of manifest destiny? If there's a place to go, we're going because that's
Yeah,
what we do. And the men are like,
your
hey,
ovaries.
there's a
Next stop, your
place.
ovaries.
We need this. We need to be in this space. So like, I'm sorry, sir. There is something that's reserved just for women. Because what was interesting in the story is that of course, this is not a comprehensive novel. We don't have, 100 years to figure out how this universe was created. We don't know that. But it does not seem that when she saw the lady with the ribbon at the art class, or the woman at the school play where they're making the costumes where she has a ribbon, they're not chit-chatting about it. They're not like, hey, I got one, you got one. How'd you get yours? Like there was no mention of that. It was just like acknowledged. I visually see it. You just move on. So for
Mhm.
me, it was that question of, is that like trauma that people could recognize it and not acknowledge it to another person, but if you have it yourself, you know what that's about. And I loved at the end where she said, hey reader, if you want to hear the gory details about like what my wound looks like around my neck, is it bloody and gross and oozing, or is it denuded, like for me, like Barbie's lady parts, like a plastic? She said it was denuded, like it doesn't have any
Mhm.
differentiation, you don't know what it's like. She's like, I don't know, because my eyeballs are now pointing on the floor because my head has fallen off. And so I just thought that
Mhm.
was also just such an interesting way to remind us that something obviously traumatic happened to this woman to have this like supernatural or weird thing happen. But what does it symbolize? Because Joey, here's where I got really stuck. You gotta help me out here. All throughout the story, she says, let me tell you the moral of the story. She tells all of these gruesome, goosebump inducing kind of fairy tales that you would tell kids, or campfire stories. I don't even, they probably have a name, but I'm too lame to know what it is, about like these scary horror stories urban legends. That's what it is. She
There
tells
you
all of
go.
these urban legends. And it's always the woman who's getting killed every single freaking time. One time she's like, oh, the man and the woman got killed together, but then their baby daughter got like raised by wolves. So I'm like, still, the worst case scenario happened to the female. And I was
Mhm.
like, thank you, author. What's the moral of this story? What are you telling me? You tell me about all these stories that are morality tales. Like she's telling us about some things. What are you telling me here? And I could not land, because she's about female empowerment, she's about sexuality, she's about men and women enjoying each other sexually. So there was no prudishness on her part.
That's for sure.
She does not shy away from bodily functions. She does
Mhm.
not shy away from really tough topics. And yet, and yet, the main character is undone literally by her husband when he just couldn't resist the one last thing. And she did, Joey, if I was going to be a little stickler on this, my reading of the end of the story, she said to him, hey, I know you want to touch this. Do you really want to do it? I don't want you to do it, but do you really want to do it? And he's like, yes. And she's like, okay. And she let him, and then her head fell off. So
Yeah.
I think she like, was that self-sacrifice? She did say earlier, just a couple paragraphs before that, she's like, something in me is shifting. I don't know what's going on with me, but something is shifting. So it's this like a story of women who are entering later life, like her son is gone. She's kind of like adrift. She doesn't have, at least in the story that we would see, she doesn't have a job. She doesn't have a purpose. She doesn't have anything kind of holding her together. And maybe she's just like, okay, like I'm just sick of fighting you on this and being on guard that you're going to touch it. So I'm asking you, do you want to touch it? And he's like, "Oh yeah." And then that leads to her demise. Is that the moral of the story? Pick a
Don't
husband who's
undo
not
your ribbon.
yeah, it's like
That's it.
pick a husband who's not going to push past your limits. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know that there's one specific moral to this story because it's so complex and so nuanced that I don't know. If there is a singular one, I don't know what it is. I think there are many morals to this story and certainly about consent and partnering with someone that respects your boundaries and respect your body when you're incapacitated and you cannot necessarily make a decision for yourself. Okay, like the husband stitch part. So, but the stories that she tells in between, I loved that part so much. If you love storytelling for the sake of storytelling, this is a story for you. Okay, I'm so, that would be my pitch because this is I was also trying to figure out like why is she doing this? And it sounds like we were both kind of being like, well, I get it and I like what you're doing, but why are you doing it? I want to know that part. Like what is this serving? What purpose is this serving to the storytelling? So I thought that the story within the story was her way, the protagonist's way of trying to get us to get to know her without her having the language to be able to explain herself to us. So I don't want to read the whole story, but I'll just read up. Maybe I can say it fast, so it's not that long. One of the stories I just want to read so that we get an understanding of like what is it that she's trying to tell us. There is a story they tell about a girl dared by her peers to venture to a local graveyard after dark. This was her folly. When they told her that standing on someone's grave at night would cause the inhabitant to reach up and pull her under, she scoffed. Scoffing is the first mistake a woman can make. I will show you, she said. Pride is the second mistake. They gave her a knife to stick into the frosty earth as a way of proving her presence and her theory. She went to that graveyard. Some storytellers say that she picked the grave at random. I believe she selected a very old one, her choice tinged by self doubt and the latent belief that if she were wrong, the intact muscle and flesh of a newly dead corpse would be more dangerous than one centuries gone. She knelt on the grave and plunged the blade deep. As she stood to run, she found she couldn't escape. Something was clutching at her clothes. She cried out and fell down. When morning came, her friends arrived at the cemetery. They found her dead on the grave, the blade pinning the sturdy wool of her skirt to the ground. Dead of fright or exposure, would it matter when the parents arrived? She was not wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. Afterwards, everyone believed that she had wished to die, even though she had died, proving that she could live. So I love this one in particular. There's other ones like the Corpse Bride one that I liked as well. But first of all, we get another kind of nod to that short story collection, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. These are very much like bite-sized little things that you would tell to scare the shit out of your friends and yourself because it came with scary illustrations too, and it was great. Everyone should read it. I'm sure if I read it as an adult, I would still be scared. But in this one, I think that she's trying to communicate that she feels stuck and that she did it to her damn self. And I'm not victim blaming her in any way, but she's this girl in this little parable stuck the knife through her own skirt, but could not see that it was just her knife. It wasn't a skeleton or a corpse hand. It wasn't the undead zombie clutching her and keeping her in place. It was literally herself. She physically got herself stuck. And it was only because she couldn't mentally divorce herself from this tale that she couldn't just pull the knife out of the ground and walk home and be safe. So to me, this was the protagonist's way of explaining to us like that she doesn't really have the language to explain to herself or to us that she feels stuck in her position and she doesn't know how to get out of it because she doesn't see an exit strategy. She doesn't see the exit sign here, and that she doesn't have the ability to just get herself out of it, which is true for, again, this is like something that happens in abusive relationships where it's hard to see something this logically from the inside when you're the victim of this violent relationship or abusive relationship. So I really loved that she added those because I think it was great. I loved it. No, no notes.
No, so Joey, I have just a few more things to say, and I know we're almost out of time. But when you were reading that, it reminded me that when she said, scoffing is the first mistake a woman can make. I will show you, she said. Pride is the second mistake. As it turns out, being right was the third and worst mistake. So
Hmm.
again, when I asked, like, what moral of the story? Like, what are you telling us? Why do you tell us all these tales? And they're like parables of like, okay, well, these are the consequences of your actions. And I want to just go back when we were talking about abuse, about so many times in this story, she witnesses something as either a child or as a woman and is told that her experience did not happen by a man or by her mom, who then got her father to say that didn't happen. Like you didn't see toes in the
The potato.
refrigerated case at the local grocers. Like no one would
Hmm.
ever do that. And she's like, but I
Hmm.
saw it.
Yeah.
And he's like, but nobody else saw it. And she's like, I hate to mention to you, Dad, but sometimes only one person sees something, and that does not mean it is not true. And so it was this like sort of form of gaslighting or mansplaining. I don't know, throw out some of those words that we all hate, that they invalidated her experience to say, no, that did not happen to you. Like when she was like, oh, the anesthesia, I wasn't sure. Like, did they say that? Did they not say that? Did that actually happen? And Joey, I don't know if you've ever received stitches. I received stitches in my knee when I fell down and needed stitches. There is a very specific feeling of being tugged and pulled by the string, by the thread, the sutures pulling you together. And she mentioned that in that story. So again, I just wanted to go back to the way in which she used sort of universal experiences that a man or a woman could experience in their outside life, not necessarily in a sexual way, to just pinpoint what happened. 'Cause she said, yeah, I remember being like really groggy and I felt like something like tugging at me, but I wasn't sure because I was under anesthesia, but maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. I'm like, that happened. You know it happened. He knows it happened. And thank you for reminding us that people can talk themselves out of the truth because they're like, that can't be true. Like, who would have done that to me? I'm like, lots of people. That's who.
Yeah. I just want to read that one line that you just mentioned that she says to her father. She says, or she would have said, she says, as a grown woman, I would have said to my father that there are true things in this world only observed by a single set of eyes. And I was like, damn, if that's not a golden line that will stick with me, that is, I mean, that kind of sums, that's just like a great line to pick out of this entire story to sort of symbolize things. Like just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Not everything is surface level. I don't have physical bruises and cuts. I mean, she does have a physical example of some abuse with her husband's stitch that she was forced to have. But yeah, it's like it doesn't it because you didn't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And I like the terms gaslighting and mansplaining. The more language we have to call out abuse when it happens, the better. Because then it's not going to happen again, hopefully.
Yep. And thank you for taking us there, Joey. And I think when I get a little sensitive about the words mansplaining and gaslighting is that I think at times they are so overused that they might lose their impact. And I personally cannot give you a clinical definition of what they are. So I'm like, well, I have a feeling of what those things are about. And that's why I get a little concerned about the exact word uses we use. Cause like, well, you know what? It's like saying bullying. Well, you know what that means to you. Well, maybe bullying is different to me, but we all agree that it's not a thing we should be doing in any context. So we may not have the specific example that we both go to be like, well, that's bullying, but we both know theoretically that these are things that are happening. And she even calls out bullying in this story in relationship to her son, who she said
Mm.
is a kind and a compassionate boy. And as he sees somebody else at school who's like the last one to walk, he's not going to be a bully. And she tells her son, don't be a bully because there are enough bullies in this world. And so there's this sweetness of her. She's not in my reading of the story, this is not anti-male. This is not a man hater. This is a person who is acknowledging that certain structural constructs and personality traits lead to not awesome outcomes sometimes for women. But I do not feel that this story is anti-men. I think it's more about being receptive and responsible to what your partner has clearly expressed and what their rights are as a human being equal to you. So I just loved everything about this story, Joey. And I'm sorry we're out of time because there's so much more. So what do
Yeah.
we always say? Hey, everybody, go read the story. It's
Yeah,
in
read it.
Granada
It's free.
Magazine. It is so incredibly good. It's a little long and it's going to cause some emotion. So like just give yourself a little empty space to really absorb the story because dollars to donuts, as they say, I'd make a bet that you're going to want to read the story more than once because on second reflection, when I read it again, I was like, so many more things make sense. She's so good
Mhm.
at like putting these little Easter eggs in and like making you pull this string together of like, what is she getting at?
Yeah. Also read In the Dream House, her memoir. It's fantastic. It's amazing. I read it for school, for in college, and I read it in one setting when I wasn't supposed to because it was that good. I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing.
And as often happens, Joy, I'm like, I've never heard of this author before. And as soon as you said her body and other parties, I'm like, oh my gosh, I heard Terry Gross or someone else talking about this beautiful novel and this amazing young up and coming talent on NPR back in 2017 or 18, whenever this came out. So it's like
Mhm.
these little echoes in my brain. It's like, yep, she's been out there. So, Joy, we've talked a lot about the storytelling elements and these creepy urban legends and kind of fairy tale endings and like what are good stereotypes in fairy tales and what are not, like the woman who was raised by wolves and then she has wolf puppies and just like there's a lot of interesting things going on in this story. And it makes me think about the conversations we have had about the purpose of fairy tales. Specifically, as you said, as a millennial, you're like, yeah, we read really, really scary stories geared for children. And I always have a big question mark above my head. I'm like, why are we scaring children with violence and murder and scary stuff? There's a little part of my brain that does not compute that, but I would be very curious to hear about your experience about that and any stories that you can think about that also ask us to examine the utility of telling kids violent fairy tales.
I do have an interest in discussing other sort of fairy tale esque horror stories. Next week, we're going to be discussing The Witch by Shirley Jackson, and we're going to have a special guest appearance by Chris, who was a fan, or maybe a super fan. Of the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. So it's really cool that we get to have someone that actively listened and appreciate what we had to say. And now he gets to share his opinions on this story.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. I am really looking forward to that conversation and exploring Shirley Jackson again. We did read The Lottery and discuss that. So I think this is going to be a great discussion.
Thank you for listening to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And don't worry, it'll be our little secret you stepped out of your literary comfort zone. Check out our link tree to follow us on TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Storygraph.